listen to this. I'd like to hear more about how the progressives versus founders' view of human nature manifests itself in contemporary society. I'll do that as we go along. In writing legislation, first of all, he mentions his Capitol Hill experience. In writing legislation, almost every bill confronts the human nature issue. Think about that. In their bones, liberal Democrat staffers feel that man is basically good, and their bills are enlightened and make life better. Of course, a lot of us don't agree with that, but we just don't know. We don't know how better life could be. They never view their bills as limiting liberty. Also, they never see their own ambition, and certainly they never see their bosses' full-throated blind ambition, which is not to say Republicans don't have as much ambition. I'm not saying that. He's not saying that. And striving for power. Conservative Republicans are much more skeptical of themselves and of their bosses. Rhinos just keep thinking, why can't we just get along? Perfect. It speaks for itself. I don't have to say anything else. Next slide. Okay, from Ryan. He thinks that the likely massive wave of direct challenges on the part of states to the direction of our federal government is heading. He mentions lawsuits from Texas, North Dakota, and Montana. Yes, for a number of years now, the state's attorneys general have been divided between blue and red groups. And certainly in the red group, Texas tends to be the leader because they've got the largest staff in the Solicitor General's office. And all of this is fine. States are intended to push back against the federal government. I have no objection to liberals or conservatives doing it, as long as they are doing it in the constitutional process. That is, either through the Congress, which of course they're not doing, but through the courts. That's legitimate. But there are some cases in which some groups, not just on the left, even certain Republican state attorneys general, are doing other things in trying to get into national policy without following the constitutional process and expanding and trying to allow states to set national policy. States get a role insofar as their representatives work through Congress. States do not set national policy except by good example that other states may follow. They get to set their own policy. That's it. Next slide. So back to the Federalists. A large republic has the same advantages over a small republic that a small republic has over a pure democracy. That's the flip of what the anti-federalists wanted. They reluctantly looked at representation as simply a practical matter because not everyone could meet together. Whereas, as I said before, the Federalists see representation as the solution to the problem of factions. And they admit there's a mean. And the problem to figure out is, well, what is that mean? How many members of Congress are too many? 1920, the Congress set a limit on the number in the House of Representatives. And every 10 years, we go through this process of changing and allocating seats in the House of Representatives. Interestingly, in 1920, after the census, Congress failed to do its constitutional duty to allocate or reallocate seats, because the old practice had been, well, since we didn't want to take anybody's seat away, we just kept expanding and expanding. And while the state lost power, the more important thing was that particular representatives didn't lose their power. So, as we know, it's all about power. Further down, the federal constitution forms a happy combination in this respect. And this is really important. And I wanted you to pay attention to it because the questions and comments I get from students reflect they don't understand this. The great and aggregate interests being referred to the national, the local, in particular to the state legislature. Hamilton never cared about local issues. That's it. He was not a modern day ideologue that wants to suck in all power. He cared about national defense, foreign affairs, and commerce. That's it. Now, when you want to find out why things have become more nationalized over time, we're going to do that in the next essay, which is about commerce. Next slide. Okay. So Michael, I'm going to pick up parts of his statement and question. Brutus goes on to say representation is merely nominal. Brutus is correct, Michael thinks. Can Madison's plan to contain the effects of factions really be? If you understand that the Federalist approach is a divide and conquer approach. They both, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, agree that factions are bad. So the Anti-Federalist approach is, okay, let's just have one faction and make that faction all the same, that they don't disagree. Madison explodes that idea because that's contrary to liberty. So if factions are bad, the solution is to multiply them. Wait a minute, if they're bad, why would you multiply them? It's a divide and conquer strategy. In many countries, I take Mexico for the way it was for 70 years, there was two factions, the party that controlled the government, and everybody else. When you have two factions like that, that's all you have. That's a prescription for revolution or tyranny. It's one or the other. The whole scheme of Federalist 10 is to not only break up factions, but to multiply them. By multiplying them, you do several things. You reduce the power of any one. At least you did before the electronic revolution. We're dealing with a different situation today, in large part because of the change in our technological situation. And that is a challenge. I don't deny that. But this whole idea, it drives two things, maybe three things. It gets people focused on commerce, which will be the next essay. By being focused on commerce, they're going to break up into more factions. Think about how in this country, per the great economist Schumpeter, innovation is always destroying oligarchies. You think about cable television. When they began, they were the little guys and they wanted protection against the big networks. Now it's the other way around. And social media is eating them up. So with technological change comes all kinds of benefits that actually confirm the Federalist viewpoint. A lot of people who are uninformed say, well, they didn't understand technological innovation. That's 200 years ago. They didn't know what we're dealing with. No, they set it in place for it to work this way. That's the whole point. Anyway, next slide. Thank you, Michael, for that. Okay, a large republic, again, has the same advantages. Down here, that's a continuation. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. Fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will be a majority found in the same party. Think about small areas in a state and how easy it is to get more or less people, certainly in a rural area, who generally are of the same mind on many issues. Next slide. Okay. So Shay's got a question. I'm just going to go down to the highlighted part. Does our current system, dominated by two parties, fall within the system they did not want? Well, first of all, when you talk about factions, you're talking about parties. Now, what Shay means is organized parties. Well, Madison started the first organized party, the Democratic Republican Party. It's really the Republican Democratic Party, but it's become the Democratic Party. Why? There were two understandings of party. It comes from Montesquieu. There were the Democratic Republicans in Montesquieu, and there were the aristocratic Republicans. So it was not only that they were claiming the Democratic Republican label, but they were saying, in effect, that the Federalists were aristocrats. That was part of it. Now, it is Andrew Jackson later on that forces out the Republican Party, and it becomes the Democratic Party. We'll talk more about that, at least when we go on this. But, Shay, you assume that there are national parties. Some years ago, I had the privilege of speaking in the First Bank of the United States in Philadelphia to a group of ambassadors from the OAS, the Organization for American States. When I got done with my talk about the Federalists and all this, the head of the delegation, the ambassador from Mexico, stood up in great frustration and he said, "You don't have any parties." I said, "That's it. We have 535 parties, all entitled, me, myself, and I. Those are the parties. Look at it. There's always the attempt on the national parties to control the local parties. The Democrats have more success in this than the Republicans. There is, just look at what's happened to the Republican Party right now, but it's always been this way. We have really a confederation of parties. Historically, that's what it's been. As Will Rogers says, I'm a Democrat. I'm not a member of an organized party. They've gotten more organized since he said that. But the parties are locally controlled, just like local government is locally controlled. And that plays into the question of representation. Next slide. The same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of action is enjoyed by a larger over a smaller republic, is enjoyed by the union over the states composing it. Next slide. Okay, so Warren's got a question. Madison overlooks, he thinks, the risk that consolidation of power at the national level would inflame passions and breed interstate resentment. Well, wait a minute. We have what's called competitive federalism, as opposed to German federalism, which is cooperative federalism. In cooperative federalism, you're supposed to be the same from state to state as everybody else. In the US, we have competitive federalism. If you don't believe this, compare California and Illinois and New York to Texas and Florida. Where are all the corporations going? They're not going to those three blue states. They're going to the red states. And it's competition. And it's competition on the things that count for business. Now, a lot of people don't like that. They think it's somehow demeaning to have people compete on economic matters. It was set up that way it's one way of controlling taxes. It's one way of controlling taxes. Taxes get too high in Illinois, people leave. The wonderful thing in this country is we can all vote with our feet. You live in Central America where they're all separate sovereigns. You can't vote with your feet, at least legally. And where do they want to come? Here. Then Uncle Sam would assume more and more power, treating local and particular interests as a great and aggregate interest. There's some in government who want to do this, but you haven't studied yet, or we haven't gone over what they've done, the Federalists, in terms of the creation of Congress and how it is shaped in its relationship to the presidency and to the federal courts. So the Federalist framework, and this the Anti-Federalists didn't like, is complex. In many ways, it's an engine. And if you look at one part without looking at other parts, it looks dangerous. Think about an automobile, because this is in many ways like an automobile engine. Remember, it's designed to be self-contained. You get in a car for the first time, you see an accelerator, you say, oh, the accelerator could do a lot of damage. It's powerful. It could take you, well, but wait a minute. There's a steering wheel. There are brakes. There are more and more safety precautions. But most importantly, there's the driver. There is responsibility in a republic that you can't just sit back and be an observer. It assumes that you're a participant, at least at the local level. Next slide. So Leo, again, going to the highlighted part. Does it seem practically viable, let alone politically, to affect a top-down structure similar to checks and balances, which would be able to control and restrain the collapse of political interest into the large party systems? And part I've already answered that. But remember, the Constitution is only a partial government. It doesn't tell the states what their constitutions are, except they have to be Republican, and that's not defined. And it tells them a few things that they can't do. And the things they can't do are mostly foreign affairs, national defense, the things that were moved from the local level to the federal level. Why? We need to defend the whole country. We don't need to have individual states deciding when to go to war. We're not like the Yugoslav Republic was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I once entertained the Assistant Secretary of State for Slovenia before it was a separate country. That would be like Texas having its own Secretary of State. That's nonsense. That's a confederation. That's what we don't have. Next slide. The advantage of the number of states isolating. Now, we all know about quarantine. Right? We all know about quarantining now. A lot of times people look at it depends on which side you're looking at, but many people who don't like it refer to a patchwork of laws in the United States. That's called federalism. Yes, it is a patchwork. It means it's different. It means it's not uniform. When you're at the federal level, if you've ever worked in any of the agencies, you will know whatever policy you're working on, it must be uniform. That's the nature of it. The whole point was to put at the federal level only those things that should be uniform. Commerce, national defense, foreign relations. That was it. So when you're talking about the expansion of power, I want you to pay attention, especially when we get to 23, to the reasoning process about the objects, the powers themselves. Almost all of you have in the back of your mind progressive assumptions about power. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within the particular states. Louisiana has always been great at this. Huey Long and then later David Duke, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration to the other states. And this is important. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed across over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for abolition of debts, for equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the nation, of the Union, than a particular member of it. Any of that sound familiar down here? Equal distribution of property. All of this is part of what? What we would say is socialism. Next slide. Socialism. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. And there are two definitions. The first one is obsolete, but look at the first date in which it's used, 1801. Well, let's go to the second definition on the next slide. This is more what we think about as being socialism. Look at its first date of use, 1833. 1833. In other words, the term socialism did not exist when Madison was writing. Madison was describing socialism, but what he's describing is a form of democracy. He is describing the form of democracy of the anti-federalists. That may sound harsh, especially since so many members, as I said before, the Federalist Society are in fact, in their thinking, anti-federalists. But that's because you're operating off assumptions that you should reject. You're operating off progressive assumptions, and you think that the anti-federalist view is the only way to deal with it. Okay, next. So now we turn to Federalist 11. This is really important. And again, we're back to Hamilton. Okay, next slide. Unity about internal and foreign commerce. First of all, the importance of the Union in a commercial light in fact, commanded the most general assent of men. This applies as well to our intercourse with foreign countries as with each other. Interestingly, at the time of the ratification, there was not much debate about the Commerce Clause. But after the ratification, many of the cases we get are Commerce Clause cases. Why is that? Did somehow the Federalist or the Federalist courts change things? No. It's just that the anti-Federalists didn't understand and didn't read closely the text of the Commerce Clause. What does the Commerce Clause say? Congress has power over what? Commerce among the states, with Indian tribes, and with foreign nations. Why among the states instead of with the states? Well, let's do it this way. Suppose it had said that Congress had the power to regulate commerce among foreign nations. Ridiculous. That is a supervisory power. It's over. Congress has no such power. Okay? When you say among the states, Congress is gotten a supervisory power over commerce. That is different from what many of the anti-federalists thought they were getting. What they thought they were getting was simply the removal of tariff and trade barriers from one nation to another. But as the European Union, a confederation, understands, one of the few things they seem to understand, but they do understand that you have to have a power to enforce those rules. Our confederation, our Articles of Confederation, had no such power. Now, what Europe has done is to lodge all this tremendous bureaucratic power in Belgium to enforce what we do in a very different way. Okay, so next slide. The commercial character. What we have in the Federalist view is a commercial republic. It is an extended commercial republic. It is the first government in history to figure out the way to bring about political peace among different factions is to grow the economic pie. And the way you grow that pie is expand it. Next slide. This requires an active commerce. And I'm going to contrast that with the passive commerce, which was promoted by some of the anti-federalists and certainly by Jefferson and his agrarianism. By prohibitory regulations extending at the same time throughout the states, we may oblige foreign countries to bid against each other for the privileges of our markets. Guess what? We have forgotten that wisdom, but China has picked it up. Why? Further down, the importance to any manufacturing nation of the markets of 3 million people. We've grown a lot since then, but China's grown a lot more. You're talking a market in China of 1.4 billion people, 4 times our market. They are using, in large part, Hamiltonian wisdom, where we are not. Next slide. Such a point gained. Okay. I have the term geopolitics up here. They didn't use that term back then. The term was invented at Oxford the beginning of the 20th century. And it was taken up by a former free marketer who realized that Germany was eating their lunch and was a threat. He abandoned free markets in order to go to geopolitics. But Hamilton's way ahead of them. Okay, the question is, how do you deal with foreign commercial powers that don't want to play by your rules? It's a matter of negotiation. In geopolitics and game theory, it's all about divide and conquer your enemy. It's about negotiation. In game theory, the simple non-mathematical thing is to talk about prisoner's dilemma. The prosecutor or cop goes into two defendants, separates them, tells each one of them, well, you know, if you don't plead now, you're not going to get the deal. Okay? That's exactly what Hamilton's talking about. Such a point gained from the British government, and which could not be expected without an equivalent in exemptions and immunities in our markets. Okay, we get something from the Brits, they want something back. What does this do? Effects on the conduct of other nations. I can tell you that when the US stopped doing as much with WTO and went to bilateral trade agreements, and I worked on the implementation of CAFTA, tell you this, what happened in Central America. Down there was probably a majority against CAFTA because, frankly, the US was shoving a lot of things down their throat that they really didn't want. But the alternative was this, and they knew it. If we don't adopt and agree to CAFTA, this business that we have now in manufacturing is going to China. They knew that. And that's why CAFTA passed, I think. And I think many also think that. Next slide. Under a vigorous national government, the natural strength of the resources of the country directed to a common interest, okay? When he's talking about the resources, he's not talking about all of the departments of government we have today. He's not talking about education. He's not talking about health. He's not talking about any of that. But when you hear national power, many of you are thinking about all of this stuff that's been taken from local level and put by progressives at the federal level. That was not the Federalist version at all. But there is something about an act of commerce, and I want to talk more about it on the next slide. Disunion, passive commerce and commodities. But in a state of disunion, European powers could confine us to a passive commerce. How? The agrarians under Jefferson were focused on agriculture, not manufacturing, not processing. But where were the markets? England was the market, okay? But if all you do is, like many countries in the world, you ship your agricultural goods, you are at the mercy of whatever countries are processing those goods. That's the reality. We should thus be compelled to content ourselves with the first price of our commodities. Commodities are governed by a world price. There are markets for commodities. Commodities mean that there's no difference in them. They're all essentially the same. Yeah, there's certain variants on coffee. I understand that. But in this country, what people are always trying to do is to take a product, let's say a shaver, and they're trying to turn it from a commodity into something special, or gasoline into something special. Gasoline is a commodity. So they've got to market in such a way that you get an attachment to it. Anyway, that's where we would have been had Jeffersonian agrarianism prevailed. Next slide. An unrestrained intercourse between the states themselves will advance the trade of each. Now, he's all for free trade internally by an interchange of their respective productions, not only for the supply of reciprocal wants, but for the exportation to foreign markets. He's all for exportation. The Constitution prevents tariffs on exports. The South wanted that, but he wants it too. We want to promote that, but we want to have one voice in dealing with other countries. Next slide. This is from my late friend, Forrest McDonald. It's Alexander Hamilton, a biography. This is much more substantive than Chernov's biography that was the basis for the play Hamilton. And I like the play Hamilton, don't get me wrong. But if you really want to understand Hamilton, you need to read Forrest McDonald. Having used Smith, meaning Adam Smith, in his rejection of agrarianism, okay? So Hamilton used that against Jefferson. Hamilton next rejected Smith, Adam Smith's own central argument that economic activity is regulated by natural laws and is most beneficial when government does not interfere with its workings. Now, conservatives believe that government shouldn't interfere with its workings, but hold up for a minute. Hamilton could endorse non-interference as an ideal, but as a statesman and not a theorist, he saw that it was unrealistic in practice. The nations on whose the United States depended for markets and manufacturers were committed to mercantilism. Next slide. Free trade, Adam Smith recognized, requires limited government and legal protection for property rights. Westerners often forget that the rule of law is the exception. This is something I wrote. The late Milton Friedman, in a rare confession of error, recognized the rule of law's primacy. Interviewed by Cato Institute, Friedman said that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he was often asked, what should these ex-communist states have to do in order to become market economies? He responded, I used to say, you can describe that in 3 words, privatize, privatize, privatize. But I was wrong. That wasn't enough. Yeah, they privatized, and guess who got the private property? The former KGB agents, the security people who left the Communist Party. When I mentioned going to the Czech Republic, we had a travel agent, right? Travel agent had just left the party. He saw what was coming. He set up his own business. He quickly started complaining about how people didn't know how to work. Well, no, as they used to say in Czechoslovakia, the government pretends to pay us and we pretend to work. They weren't habituated to it. Hamilton is all about getting us to work for the benefit of the whole. Next slide. Okay, we're through 11. So what we're dealing with is a commercial republic. Now, in 15, it's all about destroying the notion of a confederation as a viable government. First slide. It was the view of the Federalists that we're almost at the last stage of national humiliation. Now, it depends on one's viewpoint. A lot of the anti-Federalists thought that that was, way too much. We weren't there yet, but they didn't deny that we were going there. But he was much more concerned about foreign affairs and the economy in terms of the value of the currency. Next slide. The great and radical vice in the construction of the existing confederation is the principle of legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities, and as a contradistinguished from the individuals of whom they consist. That's what it was under the Confederation. That's what it is under the European Union, basically, despite the power in Brussels. Brussels may issue directives to the countries. They're supposed to implement them, and they can implement them in certain variations. The problem with this was addressed in the Prince case, in Justice Scalia's opinion on the Brady gun case. It is an issue of accountability. When the central power tells the state power to do something and it does it, and the people don't like it, they look at the state power and say, why are you doing this? And the state power says, well, I was forced to do it. It's not my fault. The problem in government is always accountability. Always. The states were left with the control over almost everything that affected people's daily lives. And in large part, it still is. But they know who's accountable for not picking up the trash. It's the mayor. They know who's accountable for not enforcing law. It's the mayor and or the chief of police. They know who's accountable in terms of statewide law. It's the legislature and the governor. And these are the many interests that have been left at the state, except to the extent that progressives have moved them to the federal government. So this is what he's rejecting. Now, interestingly, in the Prince case, Justice Breyer in dissent said, well, I don't see why we can't do it the way Europe does it. The way Europe does it is very nice. And Scalia's answer is, but that's not in our Constitution. That's not what we have. We rejected that. Next slide. The purpose of leagues and alliances, okay? He says there is nothing absurd or impracticable in the idea of a league or an alliance between independent nations for certain defined purposes precisely stated in a treaty. Now, the origin of leagues, I may have mentioned, but first of all, was really in the Greek islands and the Greek city-states. They were all small, and they were constantly dealing with assaults from the Persians, today called Iranians. The Iranian Persians have never stopped assaulting the West. It's been a constant thing. So both for defense purposes and for trade purposes, because the islands are separated and it requires ships going from island to island to bring food and other things, they invented really the original confederacies, although there's also indication Jewish scholars talked about the 12 tribes as being a confederal form as well. So that's the beginning of it. It's for limited purposes. There are all kinds of confederations in the world. The UN is a confederation. The WTO is a confederation. All of our alliances in Asia and NATO, they're all confederations. The key thing about a confederation is it is not based on political unity. That is, confederacies are simply utilitarian. They last as long as they are useful to all the parties to the agreement. That's it. And when they're no longer useful, they're scrapped by at least one party. And since they're treaties, they're free to do so. That's key in understanding it. So the idea that somehow this was going to continue as a confederacy, it wouldn't. It simply wouldn't. At some point, and we'll talk about this in the upcoming slides, selfishness and power seeking in different states would have caused the rupture. But I want to also bring back to the idea of how this relates to interpretation of text. So notice in the highlighted part, it says regulating all the details of time, place, circumstance, and quantity, leaving nothing to future discretion. Why? Why? If you've ever looked at the European treaties, they're humongous, tremendous. That's not our Constitution. Our Constitution is different. Next slide. This is a famous misinterpreted statement from McCullough by Chief Justice Marshall. We must never forget that it is a Constitution we are expounding, a Constitution intended to endure for the ages to come, and consequently to be adopted to the various crises of human affairs. So almost every law professor I've ever heard who cites this is citing it to justify judicial improvements on the Constitution. It means exactly the opposite. It means that it was designed to last for the ages as written. As written. Why? Remember, I talked about how the Federalist was set up with general principles and then specifics. The Constitution is general language deliberately. The specifics are in the legislation. Legislation gets outdated. So when people say the US Constitution is outdated, they're confusing it with a statute. All statutes over time become outdated. They have to be amended or scrapped. But the whole point of our Constitution was to last for the ages. On your dollar bill, Novus Ordo Seclorum, new order of the ages. And when you read the Constitution, there is almost nothing in Article 1, Section 8 on the powers of Congress, most of which deal with defense of the country, coinage, bankruptcy, few things like that. And then there's the necessary and proper clause. It is there, and we'll talk about that in 23, it is there to implement those national powers. Those national powers are at national objects. They're not aimed at everything down the line. In Justice Scalia's first book, Matter of Interpretation, he goes over this to explain that he is not a strict constructionist. Now, you have to understand that the term strict construction has a popular meaning that means sticking generally to the text. But the technical meaning in terms of law is different. Strict construction, take criminal law, for instance. In strict construction, you construe the statute against the drafters, against the government, because ambiguities have to be read in favor of the defendant, and therefore you give the words the clearest normal meaning. In the Constitution, as Scalia says, strict construction is not the proper form of construction. Strict construction is appropriate to a contract. It's appropriate to confederation. That's why you lay out all the terms. That's why in ordinary contract law, it's the terms in the contract. It's not anything else. And a government is something different. But that doesn't mean that either Marshall or Scalia are advocating loose interpretation, expansive interpretation. The terms have to be given, as he says, their full meaning and no more. Full meaning and no more. Next slide. Okay. Question from John. Again, I'm just going to go into certain highlights. In reading Federalist 15, it seems that Hamilton is more concerned with federal unity. That's right. That's all the unity that the Constitution is about. It's not about telling the states what to do. Then he is with the sovereignty of the states retained. The Constitution limits their sovereignty of the state in certain specific matters laid out in Article 1. That's it. Hamilton's personal thoughts on government eventually win out. No, they don't. Hamilton is not a progressive. The progressives rejected the founding. I don't know how many times I have to repeat that. The progressives reject the founding. They are not the heirs of Hamilton. What some of them said, we will use Hamiltonian means to raise up Jeffersonian local concerns to the national level. And that's what happened. At least this is how I read Hamilton's argument. No, you need to read some more. But we're not done. You've got to read all the way through and see how they all fit together. Next slide. Government requires laws. This is Hamilton. Government implies the power of making laws. It is essential to the idea of law that it is attended with a sanction, okay? This does not make him a positivist. St. Thomas Aquinas referred to the requirement that law have a sanction. The problem with the Confederation is it has no sanction. It has no sanction. It has no law. Okay? Today, international law professors will talk about international law. There is no international law. There's treaties, and you could break a treaty. At the time of the founding, they talked about the law of nations, and they actually followed more than we do certain principles of the law of nations. But they recognized that that area was, quote, the law of nature. It was not bound by law. Law required a sovereign in order to create the law. By coercion of the magistracy or coercion of the army. The choice really in the Constitutional Convention, and they talk about it, is in a confederation, how are you going to keep the whole thing together in turning it? You can't keep it together without a sanction. If you have a sanction, what's it going to be? Right here. It's either going to be by the courts, which is what we opted for, or it's going to be by the armies. That's what Russia was looking at when Chechnya and then Ukraine, when they were having trouble with them. Their answer is not the courts. Their answer is the military. Our attitude toward the military on insurrection, which has a particular meaning in the Constitution, not one that's recently been bandied about, they were very concerned about insurrection. And they used very carefully in a way to protect state powers, but to also protect the federal power to keep the nation together. Next slide. Promises that common interests would be sufficient proved wrong. The Confederacy, the individual states simply did not do what they were supposed to do. They didn't keep their agreements. The good faith was not sufficient to make it work. Why? Passions. And passions require government. Why? Passions require restraint, unless you think everybody is naturally good and they don't require any restraints. The passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Has been found that bodies of men act with more that word's wrong, or disinterestedness than individuals. Regard to reputation has a less active influence when the infamy of a bad action is to be divided among a number than when it is the full singularity upon one. One of the reasons we'll see later on for having a single president is to make sure, as Harry Truman says, the buck stops here. The problem in Congress, and they understood it, was everyone would attempt to avoid accountability. But you had to have a Congress, and you had to have ways to try to get them to do what they were supposed to do. Next slide. Sovereignty and power. The measures of the Union have not been executed. The delinquencies of the states have step by step matured themselves to an extreme which has at length arrested all the wheels of the national government and brought them to an awful stand. Why? The greater deficiencies of some states furnish the pretext of example and the temptation of interest to comply on at least delinquent states. This is always a problem. When one state is doing, the irony, for instance, in the European Union before England got out, England reluctantly, but did comply with what they were supposed to do. They didn't like it, but they did it. Why? They understood the rule of law. Did the European nations that actually were responsible for many of the regulations, often they didn't comply because they didn't have that culture of compliance. Next slide. This is what in economics is often referred to as a free rider problem. It's a continuation of what we just looked at. Here's what individuals or individual states would do. Why should we do more in proportion than those who are embarked with us in the same political voyage? These were the suggestions which human selfishness could not withstand, each state yielding to the persuasive voice of the immediate interest over convenience. The reality is self-interest is an overpowering motivation when it comes to government. And if you can be a free rider, most people will attempt to do that. Next slide. Okay, we're into Federalist 23. We're not going to get very far in it, but I will begin it. This is one that a lot of conservatives have difficulty with because it is actually the basis for McCulloch versus Maryland. And one of the things we're going to do is compare the language in Federalist 23 to that in McCulloch. First slide. Energetic government. The necessity of a constitution at least equally energetic with the one proposed. This inquiry will naturally divide. Now, here's where I want people to pay attention. These are the objects that the federal government is to address. And again, this will be repeated later on in Federalist 45. the quantity of power necessary to the accomplishment of those objects. What are those objects? The objects are national defense, foreign affairs, foreign commerce, and domestic commerce. That's it. Both Hamilton and Madison and the Federalists agreed that's it. That's not progressive. Next slide. The authorities essential to the care of the common defense are those to raise armies, to build and equip fleets, to prescribe rules for government of both, to direct their operations, to provide for their support. Any disagreement on this at the national level? Unless you want to secede, like there's a serious secession movement in Hawaii. Really is serious. But most other places in the United States like the fact that we have a good, strong defense. Those powers ought to exist without limitation. Does anyone want a limitation on our ability to defend the country? Should any individual state, except through its representatives in Congress, according to requirements that Congress declare war and fund the military, do we want individual states to be able to interfere in a war? I don't think so. These powers ought to exist without limitation. One of the things, when we talk about a government of limited powers, it's a limited number of powers. Some people seem to think that the federal government has all these powers, but only in a limited amount. It's like being half pregnant. You're not supposed to grow. No, that doesn't happen. Powers grow. And if you get beyond the limits in the Constitution in Article 1, all those powers will grow. But it is designed that for national defense, there's no limit on the ability to defend the country. These powers ought to exist without limitation because it is impossible to foresee or to define the extent and variety of national exigencies and the correspondent extent and variety of the means which may be necessary to satisfy them. So that relates to what Marshall's talking about, what he did talk about in terms of the ends. Next slide. So this is still Hamilton. Note truths and axioms. One thing, how many people today or how many professors today in law school talk about truth? I can't ever remember hearing it during my many years of teaching from anybody else. There were things that people believed, they had values. What are those? Is there truths? Are there principles? What are axioms? Axioms are things that are given. So for instance, in the United States, nobody is really going to run for office by saying, you know, we've got to go back 150 years. Now, they try to pan Federalists by saying, you want to go back to the founding. Yes, we do, but the founding was projected towards the future, much more than even the progressives. This is one of those truths. It rests upon axioms as simple as they are universal. The means ought to be proportioned to the end. The persons from whose agency the attainment of any end is expected ought to possess the means by which it is to be attained. I don't know whether you've had this experience, but you might have it at some point in your life if you're in a corporation or other organizational framework. I remember very clearly working with a particular dean, and this is the way he operated. He expected you to take all the responsibility, but he wanted to micromanage what you did. And if it succeeded, he got the credit. If it failed, you got the blame. The whole point was, by not giving you enough authority, you couldn't accomplish the end. Or if you did, you would do it on your own. That's a real issue. It's a matter of understanding human nature and what people tend to do. So if you are ever asked to do something, make sure you are given the tools to do it. They won't give you the tools, tell them no thanks. Next slide. Okay, what I'm doing here, and we're going to slow it down here. I want to read it, and this is what we're going to come back on next week. To employ the means necessary to an end. This is McCullough. Is generally understood as employing any means calculated to produce the end, and not as being confined to those single means, without which the end would be entirely unattainable. To have prescribed the means by which government should, in all the future time, execute its powers would have been to change entirely the character of the instrument, for reasons that I've already discussed regarding interpretation and Marshall's statement about that and the form that the Constitution was written in. Would have been to change entirely the character of the instrument and give it the properties of a legal code. It would have been an unwise attempt to provide an immutable rules for exigencies which, if foreseen at all, must have been seen dimly and with the best provided as they occur. Okay. Distinguish that when they're talking about all power and means and ends, the means related to the ends are the powers. The means to regulate commerce, that is up to the Congress. Now, it doesn't mean that Congress can do anything. And Marshall says that in McCullough. The difficulty that I always have with students here is that you don't understand, I think, how your brain has been messed with in all of your education. You don't think the way the founding generation thought. Why? It was the end of the age of the influence of Aristotle and the beginning of the modern. And this means and ends language is perfectly understandable in terms of what's called, and I use the term, moral science. It's all about means and ends. We don't use those terms in law school very much. We talk about policy. The judges should be policymakers, and they should weigh and balance. It is utilitarian, it's consequentialist. That, more than anything, is responsible for the expansion of, in the notion of the living Constitution. It is very much a matter of reasoning. And how many law students have ever had a course in logic? Not that many. Often students will tell me when I ask their opinion in a 1L class about a case, they'll say, I feel. I don't care what you feel. I want to know what you think. With that, I'll leave you, and we'll come back next week and pick up in 23 and go on to 39 and 45. Enjoy the last couple of hours of Mardi Gras.